single stone block for this castle weighs more than a car. Now, picture lifting thousands of them 300 feet in the air with nothing but rope, wood, and human muscle. No cranes, no engines, no power tools of any kind, just wooden wheels the size of a house, teams of oxen straining against ropes thick as your arm, and tens of thousands of workers who spent years of their lives turning a hillside into a fortress. This is how Edward I built Beaumaris, and Conwy, and Caernarfon, and how centuries earlier French masons raised castles that still stand today without a single machine doing the heavy lifting. Start with the number, because the number is the part nobody believes. Building a major medieval castle could pull in workers by the thousand at peak season, sometimes reaching numbers that dwarf entire cities of the era. Records from Edward's Welsh castle campaign in the late 1200s show payrolls listing masons, quarrymen, carpenters, smiths and labourers all working the same site simultaneously, a workforce larger than most towns in England at the time. Feeding that many people alone was a logistics operation. Grain, meat and ale had to be hauled in by cart and boat faster than a small army could consume them, because that's essentially what a castle construction site was. An army, except instead of fighting, they were cutting stone. The work started long before the first block went into place. Quarrying came first, and it was brutal. Masons selected stone based on how it would behave under a chisel, some types splitting cleanly along natural lines, others fighting every strike. Workers drove iron wedges into cracks in the rock face, then hammered them deeper, over and over, until a slab the size of a small room broke free under its own weight. There was no dynamite, no pneumatic drill, only repeated, exhausting force applied in exactly the right place. A skill that took years to develop and that separated a master quarryman from a labourer swinging blind. Once free, the stone still had to move. Somehow. This is where the operation gets strange to modern eyes. The wheel that did the heaviest lifting wasn't a wheel you'd recognise. It was a treadwheel crane, essentially a giant hamster wheel built for humans, sometimes 10 feet or more across, mounted at the top of the rising walls. A worker or several would climb inside and walk, turning the wheel, which wound a rope around a central axle and hauled stone up from the ground below. The mechanical advantage was real. A man's own body weight, converted through the wheel's radius, could lift a load many times heavier than he could ever budge with his bare hands. These treadwheels moved with the building. As walls rose, so did the crane, disassembled and reassembled higher up, floor by floor, following the construction like a shadow. Some castle sites kept the wheel installed permanently after completion, tucked into a tower, ready for whatever repair or addition came next. Getting stone up wasn't the only lifting problem. Getting it out of the ground and onto a cart in the first place required its own machinery. For lighter loads and shorter lifts, workers used simple pulleys and windlasses, hand-cranked winches that a couple of men could operate to hoist smaller blocks or buckets of mortar. For the truly massive lifts, gin poles, tall timber frames rigged with pulleys let a crew multiply their strength several times over just through clever rope routing. None of this was new invention. Much of it descended directly from Roman engineering, passed down through generations of builders who never stopped needing to move heavy things without machines. Timber scaffolding wrapped every rising wall, lashed together with rope in a lattice that had to hold not just workers but the stone itself, as it was hauled up and swung into position. A collapse here didn't just mean lost time, it meant broken bodies, sometimes death, and master builders knew it, which is why scaffolding design was treated with the same seriousness as the walls themselves. Mortar was its own daily battle. Lime had to be burned in kilns, slaked with water in a reaction violent enough to boil, then mixed with sand into a paste that masons had roughly a day to use before it hardened past working consistency. Miss that window, and the batch was wasted, along with the labour of everyone who'd hauled the materials to make it. Every stone that went into the wall had to fit its neighbours closely enough to hold, which meant masons dressed each block by hand, chiselling it smooth and square on site, checking angles against wooden templates, adjusting, checking again. A single wall face might represent thousands of individual chisel strikes, each one controlled enough not to crack the stone in the wrong place and waste the whole block. And this happened at height, on scaffolding, in weather that didn't care whether you were 300 feet up with a hammer in your hand. Then winter came. Everything stopped. Mortar wouldn't cure properly in freezing temperatures, so major stonework paused for months at a time, work shifting instead to quarrying, timber preparation, and stockpiling materials for the next building season. Castles that look, from a distance, like they rose in one continuous push actually grew in stop-start bursts year after year, sometimes decade after decade, following the rhythm of the seasons whether the king liked it or not. Money moved as constantly as stone. Royal castle projects like Edward's Welsh campaign consumed sums that strained even a kingdom's treasury, and surviving financial records show administrators tracking wages down to individual workers, paid by the day or the task depending on their trade. Skilled masons earned considerably more than general labourers, and master masons, the architects of the era, commanded salaries and status that put them closer to nobility than to the crews they directed. That master mason ran the entire project the way a modern architect and general contractor would combine into one person. He designed the castle's layout, solved engineering problems as they emerged, and walked the site constantly, correcting work that didn't meet standard. Some master masons became famous enough in their own time that kings fought to secure their services, moving them from project to project across an entire kingdom because good ones were genuinely rare. Beneath him sat a hierarchy nearly as rigid as the army it resembled. Freemasons, so named because they worked freestone, the finer stone used for detailed carving, sat at the top of the trade. Rough masons handled bulk wall building. Labourers hauled, mixed and carried, doing the physical grunt work that kept everyone else supplied. Carpenters built the scaffolding, the cranes, the centering that supported arches while mortar cured. Smiths kept the tools sharp, an endless task given how quickly iron chisels dulled against stone. Each trade had its own pay scale, its own guild traditions, and its own place in a chain that had to function together perfectly or the whole project stalled. Injuries were routine, common, expected. Falls from scaffolding, crushed limbs from shifted stone, the slow damage of decades spent breathing quarry dust. All of it was simply the cost of the trade, absorbed the way any dangerous profession absorbs its casualties. There was no safety net beyond whatever a guild or a lord's goodwill provided, and workers who couldn't continue the physical demands of the job often found themselves with no income and no recourse. Conscription made things worse in England's case specifically. Edward's Welsh castles weren't built entirely by willing labour. Royal officials had authority to compel skilled workers, masons and carpenters especially, from across the country to travel to Wales and work whether they wanted to or not, backed by the threat of fines or imprisonment for those who refused or fled. Some workers deserted anyway, choosing the risk of punishment over years away from home in what was, during the campaign years, still contested and dangerous territory. Transporting stone before it even reached the site was its own enormous undertaking, one that gets skipped over almost entirely in most retellings. Not every castle sat conveniently next to its own quarry. Caernarfon and Beaumaris both needed stone hauled in from multiple sources, some by cart over rutted roads that turned to mud in a wet Welsh autumn, some by boat along the coast when the terrain made overland transport impractical. A single block that took a quarryman a full day to free from the rock face might then spend another week simply getting to the building site, loaded onto ox-drawn sledges or flat barges, inched forward at a pace that made the actual quarrying look fast by comparison. Rivers and coastlines became the highways of the operation. Edward's castle-building campaign in Wales relied heavily on sea access specifically because it let supply ships bypass the mountainous, often hostile interior entirely, landing stone, timber and food directly at the build site instead of dragging everything overland through territory that wasn't fully pacified.
Alright Jack, you can offload here.
This wasn't a minor convenience. It shaped where castles could realistically be built at all, and it's part of why so many of Edward's Welsh fortresses sit directly on the coast, rather than commanding some more dramatic inland high ground. Timber told its own version of this same story. Castles needed enormous quantities of wood for scaffolding, for the treadwheel cranes, for centering under stone arches, for the roof structures that went up once the walls were finished. Local forests rarely supplied everything needed, so timber, like stone, sometimes traveled significant distances before a single beam was cut to size, adding yet another layer of logistics running parallel to the stonework. Roads themselves often didn't exist in any usable form before construction began, which meant road building became an unglamorous prerequisite to castle building, an entire phase of labor that shows up in financial records but almost never in the popular imagination of how these fortresses came to be. The scale of what got built despite all of this is difficult to overstate. Caernarfon's walls, with their distinctive banded stonework echoing the walls of Constantinople, took decades to complete and were never fully finished according to the original design. Beaumaris, built on flat land with no natural defences to exploit, relied entirely on concentric rings of walls, each one a complete fortification in itself, designed so that even if attackers breached the outer wall, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing ground beneath the inner one. None of that geometry was accidental. Master masons designed these defensive layers with the same precision a modern engineer brings to a bridge, calculating sight lines for archers, the angle a battering ram could approach, the width a staircase needed to keep attackers fighting one at a time, instead of flooding through as a group. Every design choice traded stone and labor for a specific tactical advantage, and those trade-offs got argued over just as hard as any modern construction budget. Water supply inside the walls mattered as much as the walls themselves, because a castle that couldn't survive a siege was just an expensive stone shell. Wells had to be dug deep enough to guarantee water even under prolonged siege, sometimes cut straight through solid rock by the same quarrying crews who'd cut the walls, an entirely separate months-long project buried inside the larger one. Not everyone involved was even fully human labor in the sense we'd picture it today. Animals did an enormous share of the heavy hauling that no crane could touch. Oxen pulled sledges loaded with stone across ground too soft or too uneven for wheeled carts. Horses hauled lighter, faster loads where roads permitted, and the animals themselves needed feeding, stabling, and care, adding yet another layer of logistics to a site that already resembled a small city more than a construction zone. Losing a team of oxen to injury or disease could stall a section of the project as badly as losing a crew of skilled masons. The tools themselves demanded constant attention most modern viewers never think about. Iron chisels dulled fast against hard stone, sometimes within hours of steady use, which meant smiths worked continuously, just resharpening and reforging the equipment everyone else depended on. A quarry crew without a working smith nearby effectively stopped producing usable stone within a single day, no matter how many strong arms were swinging hammers. The entire operation ran on a support economy of blacksmiths, carpenters, and rope makers, whose names never appear in any history book, but without whom the visible work simply couldn't happen. Rope deserves its own mention, because rope failure meant catastrophe. Every treadwheel crane, every pulley, every gin pole depended entirely on rope strong enough to hold tons of stone suspended in midair, and rope in the medieval period was handmade, twisted from hemp fiber by specialists whose entire trade existed to keep castle sites, ships, and siege engines supplied with cordage that wouldn't snap under load. A frayed rope discovered too late didn't just mean a dropped stone, it meant a dropped stone falling toward however many workers happened to be standing beneath it. Living conditions on site were rough even by the standards of the era. Workers camped near the build in temporary shelters that offered little protection from Welsh weather that could turn from clear to freezing rain within an hour. Disease spread easily through crowded, poorly sanitized worker camps, and outbreaks could thin a workforce as effectively as any battlefield casualty count, forcing project timelines to stretch even further, while replacement labor got conscripted or recruited from elsewhere in the kingdom. By the time a major castle stood finished, it represented something close to a small nation's worth of coordinated labor, funneled through hand tools, human muscle, and machines built entirely from wood and rope. Not one engine touched these walls, and not one motor turned these cranes. Every single stone got there because someone quarried it, someone dressed it, someone walked inside a wheel to lift it, and someone set it into place by hand, checking the angle, adjusting, checking again, thousands of times over for years, until a hillside became something that could survive a siege for centuries. There's a reason so few of these projects were ever truly finished on schedule, or finished at all in the way originally planned. Caernarfon stands today as a partially realised vision, certain towers and sections of wall never reaching the height or ornamentation the original design called for, because money ran out, or the political urgency that justified the expense faded, or a king died and his successor had other priorities. Construction on this scale wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a bet that royal treasuries, worker loyalty and political will could all hold together long enough to see a hillside turn into a fortress, and that bet didn't always pay off in full. What did survive, though, is remarkable precisely because of how it was built, not despite it. Every joint, every angle, every ring of defensive wall was the product of a master mason's calculation, checked and rechecked by hand, executed by workers who had no machine to blame for a mistake, and no shortcut to lean on when the stone didn't want to cooperate. The margin for error was thin, the cost of failure was measured in lives as much as money, and the result still stands centuries later on hillsides and coastlines across Wales and beyond. That's not a construction project in the way we understand the term today. That's a civilization proving what it could build with nothing but muscle, timber, rope, and an almost incomprehensible amount of patience.